Hi everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to talk a little bit more about these things that Aristotle calls first principles. Now on this slide you'll see that I've got a couple images here and I'll explain those in a moment. But before I do that, I wanted to say first of all, what is this thing called a first principle? And the word that Aristotle uses is the word arche, and the word arche, of course, gets translated here as first principle, but it's also the word that is translated sometimes as ruler. So in words like oligarchy or anarchy, it's actually the same root. So we could think of this thing as, in some sense, the thing that we know that is in some way the thing that helps us understand other things. Okay, that'll become clearer here in a moment. I want to show you now some texts, and then we'll come back to this slide. Now I want to talk about some texts. In the Posterior Analytics, Aristotle says, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. He says this becomes evident upon a survey of all the species of such instruction. The mathematical sciences and all other speculative disciplines are acquired in this way, and so are the two forms of dialectical reasoning. He then says that the pre-existing knowledge required is of two kinds. In some cases, he says, the admission of the fact must be assumed, and in other cases, comprehension of the meaning of the term used, and sometimes both assumptions are essential. Now, what this seems to mean then is that in order to know anything, there are some things that we need to know first before we can know those other things. Now, this then gets us to this issue of what the first principles are. Aristotle says that the first principles, and he says this, assuming then that my thesis as to the nature of scientific knowing is correct, the premises of demonstrated knowledge must be true, primary, immediate, better known than, and prior to the conclusion, which is further related to them as effect to cause. So what does that mean? Well, the principles in some sense, and here we can go back to our picture, they have to be true, first of all. They're primary, meaning that they come first, in some sense. They're immediate, which is another way of saying that they're not proven by anything. We don't actually give reasons for them. And then also they are they're better known than, say if we put these into reasoning, we're going to know the principles better than we know other things. That may not mean, by the way, that we're certain about them, but just that we know them. And then finally, that they are prior to things. So if, for instance, we put them into an argument, the principle in some sense has to be prior to the conclusion. Now, going back to our picture here then, the blocks that I've got here are setting up a kind of foundational structure, and the picture that you're looking at on the left is itself a picture of a foundation. And so in philosophy, we will sometimes speak of certain philosophers as foundationalists, which is a way of saying that they have certain things that must be known before we know other things, right? And that those things that we know, the foundations, ground the rest of our knowledge. And I'm suggesting here that Aristotle is a kind of foundationalist. Now, the unique nature of first principles seems to lead to some puzzles or some problems. And let me explain one of those problems here. Notice that Aristotle says that the first principles are undemonstrated. This is another way of saying that we don't give reasons for them. In fact, Aristotle in some cases says that the principles are, as he says, believed through themselves. Today, some philosophers would say that these are in some way self-evident or given. Aristotle's reasoning for this, which is important to note, is he says, look, if they were demonstrated, and we can see here in this illustration, let's imagine that you had a first principle, but you were able to give a reason for it, and that reason in some sense provides the reason why we believe the first principle. Well, then notice then that the first principle would no longer be first, it's no longer primary. Why? Because it's got something that supports it. Now this then leads in one of two directions. Either we can ask, and this is option one, well, what justifies or what supports this new principle? Let's call it, first principle 2. Well, we've got another principle sitting underneath it, first principle 3. Well, and we could just ask the same question all over again. How is that principle justified? And again, if we're not careful, that principle 3 will it could have a principle 4. And notice what happens now. It now leads to an infinite regress, right? It's just reasons all the way down. The other possibility, Aristotle says, is that if we have our first principle and we justify it by the second one, you could have said, well, how do you justify the second principle? And you say, because the first principle that we had, first principle 1, that one's true. But if that's the case, then that just seems to lead us into a circle. So now we've got an interesting situation, I think. The situation is this. We've got these things in our mind. They're first principles. We know them, Aristotle says. But it's kind of peculiar now, because now the question becomes, how did we get the principles into our mind? Notice from the earlier video I told you, Aristotle does not believe in Plato's theory of recollection. So we're going to have a mechanism for doing that. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about how Aristotle explains how we get first principles. We're going to look at a rather long, convoluted text, so it's going to take an entire video to look at that one. Okay, so that's all for this video. See you in the next one.